You made promises to God you never kept. You told yourself, next week, next month, maybe next year. The feeling was there at first, hot and real, but somewhere between the vow and the keeping, something cooled. You stopped noticing when it happened. Saint Teresa of Avila saw this pattern repeat itself for 17 years inside her own soul, and when she finally looked back, she wrote that those were the most dangerous years of her life. This is about what happens when affection fades so slowly you don't catch it until you're living a double life, when prayer becomes performance and promises become words you said once but no longer mean. Teresa called it lukewarmness. We call it other things now, but the machinery is the same. 1 year later, November 3rd, 1536, she made her profession, the formal vows binding her for life. Her father, Don Alfonso Sanchez de Cepeda, opposed it. She left before dawn, walked out of the house in secret with her brother Rodrigo, who was heading to the Dominicans. No goodbye, just gone. Severe, debilitating, mysterious. She left the convent to seek treatment. April 6th, 1539, Easter Sunday, she returned to Avila more dead than alive. The recovery took 3 years. By the beginning of 1542, St. Joseph healed her through what she believed was miraculous intercession. But something else started then, something she didn't name for over a decade. 1542 to 1555, 13 years minimum. Some sources stretch it to 17 if you count the root taking hold earlier. This is what she wrote about later with such brutal honesty that her confessors nearly refused to let anyone read it. Chapter 7 of her life is titled Lukewarmness, the Loss of Grace, Inconvenience of Laxity in Religious Houses. She didn't hide behind metaphor. She called it what it was. The monastery of the Incarnation was lax, not heretical, not corrupt in the dramatic sense people imagine, just comfortable, lax. There were 165 nuns by 1545, when Teresa had been there 10 years, too many. Most entered not out of vocation, but because Spanish society had no other place for women without dowries or marriage prospects. The convent became a holding place, rules bent, enclosure was barely enforced. Nuns left to visit family estates for weeks at a time to reduce expenses. They arranged their veils to look attractive. They wore jewelry. Prestige came from money, not holiness. And the parlor, the visiting room, became the social heart of the place. The convent encouraged her to receive visitors because their gifts helped the struggling economy. She was supposed to teach them mental prayer. Instead, she taught them very little and learned from them how to waste time in flattery, vanity, gossip. The visits became parties. Young men showed up. Conversations went late. An older nun warned her multiple times. Teresa didn't listen. The promises she made during her profession in 1536 were still technically in place. She still prayed. She still attended Mass. She still wore the habit. But the affection that drove those promises had faded so slowly, so imperceptibly, that by 1545 she was living two lives. One was the external performance of religious duty. The other was an interior life that had become almost entirely worldly. She writes that she would spend an hour in prayer and spend most of it planning her next conversation in the parlor, rehearsing clever things to say, thinking about who might visit. This script is thoroughly researched and factual, using primary sources directly from Teresa's own autobiography, the book of her life, written between 1563 and 1565 under obedience to her confessors, and utilizing scholarly analysis from Don Vicente de la Fuente's critical chronology published in Madrid between 1861 and 1862, the biographical research compiled by the Bollandists in their Acta Sanctorum, and the definitive textual work by Father Benedict Zimmermann, who prepared the critical edition using the photographic reproduction of Teresa's manuscript produced by the Sociedad Foto Tipografica Católica in 1873. These sources go beyond standard hagiography. They use Teresa's handwritten manuscripts, her unedited letters, and the testimony of people who lived with her at the Incarnation. This is Teresa describing herself without filters. Now back to the information. What could be wrong with that? Everything, Teresa later realized, not because conversation itself is evil, but because she was using it to avoid the harder work of confronting her own mediocrity. She understood immediately what it meant. This is what you're doing to me. Every wasted hour, every empty conversation, every time you choose comfort over conversion, you're adding to these wounds. The vision lasted seconds. The impact lasted forever. She broke off the friendship that day. But the lukewarmness continued because breaking off one friendship didn't address the deeper problem, which was that her whole life had become oriented toward receiving validation from creatures rather than giving love to the Creator. It haunted her for the rest of her life, but even that wasn't enough to stop the slow fade. You stop praying because you feel unworthy, which makes you more unworthy, which makes you stop praying more. The spiral tightens. But Teresa later realized that this was itself a sign of the low spiritual temperature of the age. Not the fault of the men themselves, but the entire system had adjusted to mediocrity. When everyone is lukewarm, lukewarm feels normal. Parlor conversations. Two loves, two masters. She was aware enough to feel the split, but not strong enough to resolve it. That awareness became its own torture. She knew she was failing her vows, but felt powerless to stop. They were never adapted for women. They didn't require strict enclosure. They allowed extended absences. They permitted visitors of both sexes in the parlor throughout the day. The system was designed for a mobile, mendicant order, not for contemplative nuns. Teresa never says the other nuns were evil. She says the structure itself was broken, and broken structures produce broken people. Morning prayer at 6, Mass at 7. Then nothing structured until evening prayer at 5. 8 hours where nuns were free to do as they pleased. Some prayed, some sewed, some sat in the parlor receiving visitors, some left the convent entirely to visit family estates. The Constitution said nuns should not leave without permission, but permission was given freely because the convent couldn't afford to feed everyone. Economic necessity produced spiritual laxity. By 1545, when there were 165 nuns, the place was essentially a boarding house for unmarried Spanish noblewomen who had nowhere else to go. She would hear voices in the corridor, laughter from the parlor, and she would go join them. The pull was magnetic. The alternative, sitting alone with her own mediocrity, was unbearable. So she filled her days with activity, with conversation, with anything that prevented her from having to face what she had become. For a brief time, the grief jolted her back to seriousness. She requested a painting of the Samaritan woman at the well as part of her inheritance. She hung it in her cell. She would kneel in front of it for long periods, praying desperately. "Lord, give me that water." The woman in the painting had a past. She had failed. But Jesus offered her living water anyway. Teresa wanted that water, but even that intensity faded. The grief passed. The lukewarmness returned. What she saw, what terrified her most when she finally understood it, was how imperceptible the decline had been. There was no single moment of decision, no dramatic fall. Just a series of small compromises, each one feeling reasonable at the time. One extra hour in the parlor, one conversation that went a little too long, one skipped prayer time because she was tired, one piece of jewelry that didn't seem like a big deal. Each choice made the next one easier. The promises she made in 1536 became words she had said, not commitments she was keeping. Teresa forgot this, or she knew it and ignored it because the alternative was too hard. Her confessors later tried to soften this language when preparing her writings for publication, but Teresa insisted. She wanted people to know how far she had fallen so they would understand how far God's mercy could reach. It's easier to sit in the parlor than to sit in silence with your own failure. Third, you develop a language to justify it. Teresa called herself too unworthy to pray. It sounded humble. It was actually pride disguised as humility. True humility says, I'm unworthy and God loves me anyway. False humility says, I'm too unworthy for God to bother with me. The first opens you up, the second closes you off. Fourth, you lose the ability to feel what you once felt. This is the terrifying part. Teresa describes moments where she would try to pray and feel nothing. Not resistance, not distraction, just nothing. Blankness. The spiritual senses had atrophied from disuse. She could still remember what fervor felt like, but she couldn't produce it. This is what she means by loss of grace. Not that God withdrew his presence, but that she had spent so long ignoring it that she could no longer perceive it. It's worse than open rebellion, because rebellion at least knows it's in conflict. Lukewarmness thinks it's fine. It was part of the furniture. But this particular day, maybe because she was already in a state of heightened awareness, maybe because grace works when it works and not before, she saw it as if for the first time. She fell to her knees on the stairs. She wept. She couldn't stop weeping. His suffering was real, and she had treated it as if it meant nothing, as if her comfort mattered more than his sacrifice. The weeping lasted hours. Other nuns found her on the stairs and didn't know what to do. Some thought she was having a breakdown. Some thought it was a spiritual experience. Both were right. This was her second conversion. She calls it that explicitly in chapter 9 of her life. The first conversion brought her into the convent in 1535. The second conversion brought her into actually living what she had vowed 19 years earlier. Then she would fail. Then she would resolve again, then fail again. The frustration nearly broke her. She wanted to be different, but didn't know how to become different. The promises remained empty because the affection that should have filled them was still rebuilding, slowly, painfully, through a process she couldn't control or accelerate. They arrived in Avila in 1555 and provided the spiritual direction she desperately needed. They taught her to distinguish between true and false humility. They taught her that abandoning prayer because you feel unworthy is itself a sin, a rejection of God's mercy. They taught her to return to mental prayer even when it felt mechanical, even when she felt nothing, because the practice itself would eventually reawaken what had died. It worked. By 1556, she was experiencing the first inpourings of mystical grace, feelings of God's presence, passive recollection, the prayer of quiet, the first tastes of union. By 1557, her first locution and rapture. A locution is an interior word. heard not with physical ears, but directly in the soul. A rapture is when God lifts the soul out of its normal state and unites it to himself so completely that the azai person loses awareness of everything else. These experiences terrified her. She thought they might be demonic. She consulted multiple confessors. Some said they were from God. Some said they were delusions. The confusion nearly drove her mad. You know Christ is present without seeing anything. By January 1561, she received an imaginative vision of the risen Christ, glorified, radiant. For 2.5 years, from 1561 to 1563, she received this favor frequently. Then for more than 3 years, from 1563 to at least 1565, Christ replaced this favor with something more sublime, which she struggled to describe, but which involved a continuous awareness of his presence at the center of her soul. They were God revealing that he had never left, that she had only stopped paying attention. The difference between 1542 and 1560 wasn't in God, it was in her. No visitors in the parlor without exceptional cause. Poverty, silence. She called them discalced Carmelites, meaning without shoes, because they didn't even wear sandals. The physical discomfort was intentional. Comfort had nearly destroyed her. She wanted her nuns uncomfortable enough to stay awake. She traveled constantly despite chronic illness. She fought the unreformed Carmelites who tried to stop her. In 1576, they held a general chapter meeting and voted that she should cease all reforms and retreat into retirement. She ignored them. The Pope eventually sided with her, and in 1580 declared the discalced Carmelites a separate province. She wrote her life, the book of her life, between 1563 and 1565. Her confessors ordered her to do it. They wanted a full account of her spiritual development. She resisted at first. She hated writing about herself, but she obeyed. The manuscript is 412 pages in her own handwriting, now preserved as a photographic reproduction by the Sociedad Fototipografica Católica of Madrid from 1873. It was never divided into chapters in her original draft. That came later. She just wrote stream of consciousness, stopping only when her duties at the spinning wheel demanded it, over to the Holy Office for safekeeping. He told Teresa she should burn it. She said she would if he ordered it. He didn't order it, but he also didn't let it out of custody. The book was only retrieved after her death by Mother Anne of Jesus when the order decided to publish her complete works. She calls herself wicked. She describes the double life. She warns that laxity in religious houses is a pathway to hell, not because God rejects the lukewarm, but because lukewarmness itself is a living death that makes you incapable of receiving what God offers. The parlor conversations gave her instant validation. Prayer gave her nothing she could feel right away. So she chose the parlor, over and over, until the choice became a habit, until the habit became a character, until she was someone who had once loved God but no longer did. Not really, not in the way that mattered. Affection isn't magic. It doesn't sustain itself. You have to feed it. Prayer is food. Silence is food. Obedience is food. Service is food. Teresa stopped eating and wondered why she was starving. And by the time she realized what was happening, 17 years had passed, half her religious life wasted. Second danger, friendships with worldly people who validate your vanity. Third danger, small compromises in the rule that seem harmless but accumulate. Fourth danger, justifying your mediocrity by comparing yourself to others who are equally mediocre. Fifth danger, avoiding prayer because you feel unworthy instead of praying because you are unworthy and need mercy. She writes that if she could go back, she would never have spent a single unnecessary moment in the parlor. Every conversation that wasn't essential was a theft from God. Every hour wasted on vanity was an hour she could have been growing in love. But she can't go back. She can only warn others. That's why she wrote so honestly. That's why she didn't let anyone soften the language. The warnings only work if they're harsh enough to wake people up. The Reformed convents she founded operated on the principle that structure matters. You can't rely on willpower alone. You need an environment that supports the life you're trying to live. The Incarnation structure encouraged worldliness. St. Joseph's structure in Avila, founded 1562, encouraged contemplation. 12 nuns initially. Strict poverty. No visitors except in extreme cases. Hours of silent prayer daily. Manual labor. Simple food. Hard beds. No heat in winter. The nuns complained. Teresa told them this was the point. Comfort had destroyed her. Discomfort would save them. He wrote poetry about the dark night of the soul, which is what happens when God withdraws all consolation to purify the will. Teresa admired him, but thought he went too far sometimes. She believed in suffering, but also in sanity. How to pray when you feel nothing. How to handle distractions. How to maintain custody of the eyes. How to practice fraternal charity when living in close quarters with people who annoy you. How to embrace poverty not as deprivation, but as freedom. Every page is built on the lessons she learned during the 17 years of lukewarmness. She knew every trap, because she had fallen into all of them. The Interior Castle, written in 1577, is her mystical theology. 7 mansions. 7 stages of prayer, the journey from the exterior life to the interior life to union with God. She maps the whole terrain. But even here, especially here, she warns about lukewarmness. The first mansion is full of people who have entered the castle, but spend all their time near the entrance, distracted by creatures crawling in from outside. They're technically inside. They made promises. They took vows. But they live as if they're still outside. This was Teresa for 17 years, inside the castle but living at the threshold. But even in the 7th mansion, she warns, vigilance is required. Not because God might leave, but because the soul might still turn away if it stops paying attention. The promises must be renewed constantly. Affection must be maintained. Love is a practice, not a possession. She had just finished founding her 17th convent. They asked her to attend a noblewoman giving birth. By the time she arrived, the baby was already born. The saint won't be needed after all, Teresa said. She died 3 days later. Her last words were about being a daughter of the Church. Made a Doctor of the Church, September 27th, 1970 by Pope Paul VI. First woman ever given that title. The honor wasn't for her visions, it was for her teaching. She had mapped the interior life with a clarity no one had matched. And the foundation of all her teaching was the warning she gave about lukewarmness, about the slow fade of affection, about the empty promises we make when we mean them but don't maintain them. Her letters survive. Hundreds of them, written in her own hand. Many are instructions to prioresses at the convents she founded. Many are encouragements to people struggling in prayer. Many are sharp corrections to nuns who were slipping into old patterns. She never stopped fighting lukewarmness, not in herself, not in others. She knew how easy it was to fall back. She knew because she had lived it for 17 years. The photographic reproduction of her life manuscript, published 1873, shows no major corrections. She wrote clean. She wrote fast. She complained about having to do it in stolen moments between her duties at the distaff, but the quality suggests she worked it out in her mind first, then wrote in single drafts. The manuscript went through the Inquisition twice, once in 1574 when someone denounced it. Cardinal de Quiroga approved it. Teresa celebrated. And then Father Banes, nervous about the risks, handed it back to the Holy Office after her death for safekeeping. It wasn't published until Father Luis de Leon retrieved it and included it in the 1588 edition of her complete works. They were looking for false mysticism, the kind that confused emotional hysteria with genuine spiritual experience. Teresa's account passed because she distinguished clearly between the two. She described her visions, but also described how her confessors tested them. She described her locutions, but also described when she resisted them out of obedience. She wasn't claiming special privilege. She was reporting what happened and submitting it all to judgment. That humility, born from the memory of her 17 years of failure, protected her. You tell yourself you'll get back to it later. Later becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. Next month becomes never. The promise remains technically in place, but the affection that animated it has faded so slowly you didn't notice, until one day you realize you're going through motions, performing a role, living a double life. She wrote about it not to humiliate herself, but to warn everyone who came after. The warnings only work if they're specific. Generic advice about being holy doesn't help. You need the details. You need to know exactly how the fade happens, so you can recognize it in yourself before 17 years pass. You need to know that the parlor conversations feel innocent, that the friendships feel harmless, that the small compromises feel reasonable, that the justifications feel humble. You need to know all of this looks normal until you step back and see that you've become someone else, someone who said words once, but no longer lives them. Teresa wrote, "You must stop this immediately. I know how these things begin. They feel like nothing. They become everything. Do not wait. Do not give her time to adjust slowly. Cut it off now while it can still be cut." The prioress obeyed. The nun complained. Teresa didn't care. She had spent 17 years learning what happens when you wait, of gradual accommodation. You don't wake up one morning and decide to abandon your vows. You make 1,000 tiny decisions, each one feeling trivial, each one moving you slightly further from what you promised. By the time you realize what's happened, the distance is enormous. Getting back requires not willpower, but a complete restructuring of your life, your habits, your environment. That's why she insisted on strict enclosure. That's why she insisted on poverty. That's why she insisted on silence. Not because these things are good in themselves, but because they create an environment where lukewarmness can't survive. Records show these nuns had lived under the same lax rule that Teresa had lived under at the Incarnation. No strict enclosure. Visitors in the parlor, long absences, jewelry, comfortable living. The bodies showed signs of ordinary lives, not the lives of contemplatives. No one knows their names now. No one remembers their vows. They made promises, and the promises faded, and they died having never become what they vowed to become. Teresa would have seen this grave as proof of everything she warned against. Structure matters. Environment matters. You cannot sustain affection in a system designed for comfort. And keeping love alive requires specific practices, sustained over time in an environment that supports those practices. There's no shortcut, there's no magic moment. There's only the daily decision to feed what you want to grow and starve what you want to die. When she finally starved it, when she finally restructured her life to make lukewarmness impossible, she became the woman we remember. Not the woman who made vows in 1536, the woman who kept them starting in 1555. Those 19 years after her second conversion, from 1555 to her death in 1582, produced everything we know her for. The writings, the reforms, the 17 convents, the spiritual direction, the mystical experiences. All of it came after she stopped letting her promises remain empty. She writes, "I thought I could not go on, but our Lord gave me strength because he wanted this house founded. I obeyed. The promises I made 46 years ago when I entered the Incarnation are still in place. I'm still keeping them. Not perfectly, but I am keeping them. That is all that matters. Keep your promises. Do not let them become words you once said. Make them words you are still living. Keep your promises. The affection that made them will fade. It fades for everyone. The question is what you do when you notice the fade. Do you justify it, excuse it, wait for it to return on its own? Or do you rebuild it deliberately through the daily practices that feed love and starve lukewarmness? Teresa chose the second path, but only after 17 years of choosing the first. She never forgot those 17 years. She made sure no one else would forget them either. And unless you do the specific work of maintaining what you vowed, you will wake up one day and realize you've been performing a role instead of living a life. Not easy, not quick, but possible. The promises can be filled again, the affection can be rebuilt. It just requires admitting what happened, changing the environment, and doing the daily work for however many years it takes. Teresa needed 19. Maybe you need more. Maybe less, but you need to start. Ooh. The feeling you had at the beginning won't carry you to the end. You have to feed it, every day, in small, unglamorous ways. Through practices that feel mechanical until they don't. Through obedience when you don't feel like obeying. Through prayer when you feel nothing. Through silence when you want noise. Through discomfort when you want comfort. This is how affection stays alive. This is how promises stay full. There is no other way. Teresa tried every shortcut. None of them worked. Only the long, hard, daily maintenance of love works. She learned this over 17 years of failure and 19 years of success. The ratio doesn't matter. What matters is that she learned it, and then spent the rest of her life making sure everyone else learned it too.